These are the lecture notes for, excuse me, for Chapter 4 on tissues. And tissues are defined as a group of cells that have similar structure, and they perform a function. Together, they perform some sort of function. Sorry. Um, I'm just trying to make sure that here we go. Okay, so tissues are groups of similar cells, and they perform a common or related function. In other words, together as a group, they perform a function. Okay. And then the study of tissues is histology. So this chapter basically is histology. It's our histology chapter. Histo means tissue, logy means study of. And there are 4 basic tissue types in the human body. They are epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. So we're going to start with, oh, it won't let me go. Okay, I'm sorry. Ugh. All right, wonder if I can go back. Let me pause this. Sorry. This slide is showing you, and I'm trying to find slide number 5. So this slide is showing you the some examples and a little bit of like a summary of each of the tissue types. The nervous tissue and muscle tissue, we really will not spend that much time on because we have chapters that cover nervous tissue and muscle tissue. But I do want you to know that nervous tissue is specialized for communication. It's specialized for communication through electrical impulses or nerve impulses called action potentials. And we find nervous tissue in the brain, the spinal cord, and the nerves that extend. We call them the cranial and the spinal nerves. Muscle tissue is specialized for contraction, and there's 3 types. There's skeletal muscle that's attached to bones, and the one that you're seeing here is the biceps brachii muscle. We see several muscles in the thigh and the lower leg. But those are skeletal muscles. They move the bones. They're attached to bones and they move the bones. Then the heart muscle is cardiac. And then there's smooth muscle, and that's the type of muscle that most people are not as familiar with. So, for example, the stomach and the intestines move food, through the digestive tract by the action of smooth muscle in the walls of those organs. Blood vessels move blood, and the airways, the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles, those airways in our respiratory system are lined with smooth muscle as well. But we have epithelial and connective tissue, which are the tissue types we're going to spend the most time on. Epithelial tissue forms linings and coverings in the body, and also glands. So the lining of the digestive tract organs and other hollow organs, inside and outside lining. Glands, like the pancreas, and then the surface of the skin, the epidermis, which is the outer surface of the skin, is epithelial tissue. Connective tissue we will cover, but we will focus more on loose and dense connective tissue. We will not focus as much on blood or bone or cartilage or lymph, which is lymphatic fluid. but we will cover the loose and dense connective tissue. It's called connective tissue proper. Now, the other connective tissue types, I will mention them to you, but again, we have chapters on those. So I just want to, cover what we need to cover kind of thing, because this is a long chapter, like all of them seem to be. In section 4.2, we're going to cover epithelial tissue. And epithelial tissue, which is also called epithelium, is a sheet of cells that either cover the surface of the body, as in the epidermis, or line body cavities. So there's the coverings and the linings, and then there is glandular epithelium that forms like salivary glands, the sweat glands, the pancreas was mentioned earlier. Functions of epithelial tissue can be protection. If there's many layers of epithelial cells, then that will be for protection. Like the epidermis of your skin is composed of many, many layers of epithelial cells. Some epithelial tissue functions in absorption, filtration, excretion, secretion, which are very closely related. And excretion is referring to waste. Secretion is referring to, it's the same process of exocytosis, but it's referring to the release of a product from the cell that's designed for somewhere else in the body. And then sensory reception, because epithelial tissue, particularly the skin, is involved in sensory reception and sending that information to the nervous system. Characteristics of epithelial tissues is that it has polarity. In other words, it has a free surface and a surface that is attached. Free and attached. The free surface is called the apical surface. The attached surface is called the basal surface. Also, since the epithelial tissue is formed from cells that are packed tightly together, they're also connected with one another through these specialized cell junctions or specialized contacts. Epithelial tissue is supported by connective tissue, kind of below the epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue almost always has connective tissue underneath it. And epithelial tissue does not have a blood supply. The word for that is avascular. But just because it does not have a blood supply does not mean it doesn't have a nerve supply. So epithelial tissue is avascular, no blood supply, but innervated. So it does have connection with the nervous system. And epithelial tissue is highly, highly able to regenerate. So again, polarity means that the cells have a top and a bottom, and that top surface is called the apical surface, and it's the free side. In other words, it's exposed to just either body fluids or the air, but it's the free side of those cells that doesn't contact anything. That's the apical surface. And then the basal surface is the lower side that is attached. It's attached first to the basal lamina, and then that is attached to a basement membrane and connective tissue underneath. So epithelial tissue has polarity, an apical and a basal surface. And you can see here, these cells are called simple columnar epithelial cells or simple columnar epithelial tissue. You can see that they're tall, column-like cells. And on their apical surface, they have these folds called microvilli, which increase the surface area because these cells are found lining the stomach and the small intestine. And the microvilli on the surface, you see how it looks fuzzy? The microvilli on the surface are folds in that apical surface that increase the surface area so more nutrients can be absorbed. And then there's the basal surface, which is attached to connective tissue underneath. So from here, all this would be like the basal surface of these cells. And then this would be the apical surface here. All right, and then the specialized contacts are going to be cell junctions, junctions that connect cells to other cells that are beside them. They're called lateral contacts. And they are tight junctions and desmosomes. So they connect the epithelial cells to one another on the sides of the cells. You do need to know that all epithelial tissue is connected to the basement membrane, is connected to a basement membrane. That would be on the basal surface of the epithelial tissue. There's always a basement membrane, and that basement membrane is attached to the connective tissue underneath. The clinical imbalance, clinical homeostatic imbalance example here says that cancerous epithelial cells are not contained by the basement membrane boundary like other cells. So epithelial cells that become cancerous, like carcinomas and melanomas, they don't have a basement membrane. So in other words, there's nothing to stop them from breaking off and entering into the connective tissue, invading the underlying connective tissue, and then the cancer is able to spread. So the difference in cancerous epithelial tissue and normal epithelial tissue is that cancerous epithelial tissue does not have a basement membrane, no basement membrane. Avascular. So epithelial tissue does not have any blood vessels. It is avascular, but it does have a nerve supply. Okay, and we talked about that already. So avascular but innervated. Now, that doesn't mean that just because epithelial tissue doesn't have a blood supply, that doesn't mean that it's not able to get nutrients and oxygen, that it needs, because it's those substances are supplied by the underlying connective tissues. And then epithelial tissue is definitely got a very high ability to regenerate. You know this because we're all the time shedding our top layer of skin, and we're able to regenerate. And if we get, say, a burn, on our skin, and we lose some skin, our skin is able to regenerate as long as it's not burnt, too badly. Now, the way that epithelial tissue is classified, so this is on the classification of epithelial tissue. The way it's classified is, first of all, based on how many cell layers. So if it's simple epithelial tissue, then it has just one single layer of cells. But if it's stratified, then it has more than one layer of cells. The lining of the mouth, for example, the epidermis of the skin, that is stratified epithelial tissue. And then the second part of the name is going to indicate the type of cell, the shape of the cell. So squamous means flat, cuboidal is box-like or cube-like, columnar is tall. Okay, so you can have simple squamous, simple cuboidal, simple columnar, and then stratified squamous, stratified cuboidal, stratified columnar. So what you're seeing here, of course, is simple squamous, a single layer of flat cells. And then what you're seeing down below is stratified squamous. And yes, the cells toward the bottom, like the cells toward the basement membrane, these cells in this row, this bottom row, is actually called the stratum basale, which we'll talk about in chapter 5. But those are more cuboidal, and as you get to the top, they become more squamous or flat. But stratified squamous is what you would call this tissue, and it's the same tissue that you find in the epidermis of the skin. So here's the shapes of epithelial cells. Squamous is flat, cuboidal is box-like, columnar is tall. and